So hello, everybody. Welcome to this session. My name is Michael Craglia. We'll turn on the recording now because we want to put this on YouTube afterwards, and then we get going. So I'll press the recording. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Michael Craglia. I'm the head of communications of the International Transport Forum. You've logged into our Ask the Author session on our latest report, which is Decarbonising Europe's Trucks, How to Minimize Cost Uncertainty. And I have with me the author, Matteo Craglia, who will take us through the findings of this report. This is a short session. We have 30 minutes. Matteo will give us the gist in 10 minutes, and then you have twice that time to ask questions. And we'll try to make the most out of that for you. But just a little bit of context before I hand over to Matteo. This report is part of a project called the Decarbonising Transport Initiative that is run by ITF, and is part of the latest project within that initiative, which runs by the name of DT Implement for short, which stands for Transport Decarbonisation Driving Implementation. And the focus of that is, of course, implementation. Going ahead to the next COP, that is really the focus of what we need to do. And this project is interesting for two reasons. The first one is that it focuses on three particularly hard to decarbonize transport sectors, namely on aviation, on maritime shipping, and on trucking, road freight, ones where we really need to make progress. The second interesting feature is that it is actually organized in a way that we call common interest groups. These are country-led stakeholder groups that kind of drive the discussions and that are part of this and that want to see results that they can implement. In this particular common interest group on trucking, we have 22 countries and I think 17 or 18 non-government stakeholders, international organizations, private companies that want to see progress in this area. The report was published, I think, last Monday, and it had 400 hits, 400 downloads on the first day. We have more than 120 registrations for today's webinar, so it's obviously a topic of great interest. And that's why we'll get out of the way and hand over to Matteo, who's the author, who will give us a short run through the findings. Before I do that, however, please put your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat, into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. That's just because they're easier to manage there for me, and we'll sort them and get Matteo to answer as many as possible. Thank you all very much for coming, and I'm handing over to Matteo Craglia for Decarbonising Europe's Trucks. Matteo.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I'll be presenting the main findings of this report in this short time, and then happy to answer any questions you may have afterwards. So this report focuses on technologies that can help to decarbonize heavy-duty road freight in Europe. Now, road freight accounts for 20% of emissions from the transport sector, both in Europe and globally, and so is a priority to decarbonize. It accounts for a significant share that we have to reduce. And road freight has traditionally been grouped in a number of sectors known as hard to abate or difficult to decarbonize. But as today's webinar will show, we may well soon have technologies and solutions that can start helping us to decarbonize. So it's a fast-moving sector, and it's an exciting sector to keep an eye on. So the aim of this analysis was to estimate the ownership costs of different types of trucks in Europe to understand their economic feasibility. And we do this by focusing on the total cost of ownership. So this is a key metric that is used within the industry, and it accounts for all of the costs associated with a vehicle over its lifetime. So including the purchase cost, the usage costs, fuel costs, and maintenance costs. And the aim of this analysis is to understand which of the low carbon technologies seem most likely to reach cost parity, be cost competitive with conventional diesel trucks, understand when that might happen, in Europe, how this might differ between different vehicle classes, different types of vehicles, different sizes of vehicles, and also understands then the degree of certainty that we can place in the results, of how uncertain are these results, and also how might that uncertainty be reduced. This is important because uncertainty in this sector is, at the moment, is a key barrier. It contributes significantly to market risk, and therefore potentially postpones investment decisions within the sector given that market risk. So any measures that can help to reduce that uncertainty are going to be important for decarbonization. So in this analysis, we focus on the three of the most prominent zero-emission vehicle technologies for heavy-duty road freight, and compare their economic feasibility to conventional diesel trucks. So the first technology are battery electric vehicles. So these are vehicles with a large battery pack, which could power vehicles and could be powered with renewable electricity, so it could be low carbon. And typically, these types of vehicles would be charged overnight, perhaps in depots, or with high power charging along busy stretches of road during their operations, or also at warehouses. Another technology are electric road system vehicles. So these types of vehicles could have a slightly smaller battery pack and instead draw their electricity from overhead wires above particularly busy stretches of road, so typically motorways. Similarly to how electric trains work today. So this would require building lots of infrastructure above main roads for these vehicles to then draw their electricity. And the final technology that we explore is hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So these use hydrogen from refueling stations within a fuel cell truck that would power the truck. And again, if the hydrogen is produced with renewable electricity or low carbon means, then that could also be a way of decarbonizing the sector. So we investigate all of these different technologies and compare their merits and economic competitiveness between all of them. And we do this also for different types of trucks. So 9 different size segments ranging from the smallest 7.5 ton trucks, which you can see in the bottom right, to all the way up to the largest trucks, and in particular, including the majority of the market, which are tractor trailers. And these account for around half of the heavy duty road freight vehicle sales. Good. So this has been quite a hot topic in the recent past, and there have been already a few analyses out there, which this analysis builds on. And in particular, the way that understanding the cost competitiveness of these technologies has been achieved is by constructing different scenarios. Now, the challenge with scenarios, they can be useful. However, they can often be quite sensitive to the assumptions that are made in developing scenarios. And this risks unintentional bias. So potentially, if one used a particularly high diesel price or a particularly low hydrogen cost, that could lead to a certain outcome that might not give the full spectrum of solutions. So, and there's significant uncertainty in the main factors that underlie the cost competitiveness of zero-emission trucks. So to account for that uncertainty, in this analysis, we aimed in particular to try and explore a range of futures for the main important factors. So in particular, we aimed to set an optimistic and a conservative case for each of the most important variables, and then explored around 1,000 scenarios to understand the full solution space, to understand the full spectrum of solutions for heavy-duty vehicles. So, for example, we include optimistic cases for the reduction in battery costs, which is, I think, figure I here. but also conservative ones in which perhaps in the short term battery costs might increase and then fall more gradually over time. We do this for all of the main variables. So what does this look like in terms of results? Without any additional policy incentives, without any economic incentives, and also without economic incentives that are in place at the moment, this is what the future would look like in terms of cost competitiveness. So this figure shows the share of the heavy-duty vehicle market that each technology could attain by having the lowest cost competitiveness. So it shows a picture of the range of cost competitiveness into the future. And what it shows is that even without policy intervention, even without economic incentives at the moment, it would suggest that battery electric vehicles in particular are likely to become cost competitive in the relatively near future. And they're likely to start being cost competitive in the smallest vehicle size segments this decade, and in larger vehicle size segments in the early 2030s. Other technologies are less likely to be cost competitive. So in particular, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are unlikely to be cost competitive with diesel or battery electric vehicles without significant policy intervention. They could potentially become cost competitive, assuming very ambitiously low hydrogen costs, in particular costs below €2.5 per kilogram. However, this is very ambitious to have at the pump, and means that they realistically are unlikely to attain significant market share for the mass market. These graphs don't show electric road systems. If we instead consider electric road systems in this figure, and in this case, we've modeled them after their adoption in 2030, we see that they could also attain market share. They could potentially outcompete all of the other technologies and be marginally cheaper than even battery electric vehicles. So electric road systems are also potentially a solution that should be considered. And it should at least be kept on the table to understand its relative merits and flaws and what role it could play being a complementary solution for other direct electrification solutions such as battery electric vehicles. However, there's still a number of uncertainties, including, as I say, this complementary nature. What exact share of vehicles would be electric road system capable, and also how intensively would the infrastructure be utilized? As I mentioned in the previous graph, without any economic incentives, the adoption of battery electric vehicles is likely to happen in the early 2030s. However, it's still relatively uncertain. And this uncertainty is particularly due to uncertainty in diesel costs and electricity costs. So these affect scenarios quite a lot. However, policy measures can help to give greater certainty and can help to shift the year that trucks are cost competitive with diesel incumbent vehicles. So in particular, options for policy measures that might help to do this could include zero interest loans or favorable government-backed loans for zero-emission vehicles. And these could help with financing costs of trucks. Secondly, purchase subsidies could also help to advance the year that the trucks become cost competitive with diesel trucks. And finally, carbon taxation could also help to reduce the gap between diesel trucks and electric trucks. And you can see here that these are crucial mechanisms and crucial policies that could help to reduce that level of uncertainty and advance the year that trucks become cost competitive. So from this analysis, we then derived 6 main recommendations for policymakers. Firstly, to ensure that policies that promote direct electrification, so battery electric vehicles or electric trucks or electric road systems, remain as technology neutral as possible for the moment and avoid closing the door to these technologies until we have a greater certainty about what their relative roles might be. Secondly, to understand what those roles might be in greater detail, we recommend to launch targeted studies and pilot projects to better understand the merits of electric road systems in real-world operation. So in particular, how long might it take to deploy them, and what might their advantages or disadvantages be, to really understand whether they are necessary or whether we could do everything with battery electric vehicles, for example. Thirdly, we recommend to further investigate other decarbonisation technologies for particularly challenging road freight applications where electric options might not be feasible. So we find that hydrogen vehicles are unlikely to be cost competitive for the mass market, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no role for them. And we recommend having targeted studies for particularly challenging use cases to understand where they might be needed. Fourthly, we recommend to introduce policies, as I mentioned before, to help accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles and give market confidence, reduce that level of uncertainty, accelerate the deployment of zero-emission vehicle infrastructure, in particular deploying depot charging and strengthening electricity grids along main roads and areas of high demand are seen as being low regret options. And finally, we recommend also to strengthen regulations such as fuel economy standards that make trucks more energy efficient. These can also help to further accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. So that was a whistle-stop tour, and I'll now welcome and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matteo. This was really interesting, and it was a little bit longer than 10 minutes, but that's okay. I have a lot of questions here. In case we don't get to answer all of them, do be in touch, send us an email. You registered. We see this as a start of a conversation. There's a little bit of an appetizer, if you like. We know we can't go into the details. Let me throw out the questions. There's one of the recommendations is to also look at other technologies. And there's a question from Peter Mishai, if I pronounce that correctly, who asks, where do you see the role of HVO, which I think is vegetable oil, basically, as a technology that you didn't look into? Why didn't you look into it, or is that one of the technologies that should also be explored?
It's a very good question. So HVO and biofuels in general could play a role in decarbonising heavy-duty road freight. However, firstly, they are unlikely to cost less than diesel fuel, and therefore, on their own, unlikely to be cost competitive. On pure merits, unlike electric options, such as battery electric vehicles, as we showed, could already become cost competitive. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't roles for these biofuel technologies. In particular, this is where they could be used for particularly challenging applications where electric options are less suitable. So particularly long distance applications in remote locations or particularly challenging use cases, there's definitely a role. And for this, we recommend targeted studies to understand, one, how big of a segment, how big of are these particularly challenging use cases? What share of emissions do they account for? And what technologies are then best placed to decarbonize them? Is it biofuels? Is it hydrogen vehicles, or potentially hybrids as well?
Great, thanks. There are a number of questions on your assumptions and sort of what you factored into your analysis. Maybe I'll kind of group a few of those. One is on a question on ERS, so the electric road systems, the road trains, one could maybe call them for people who are not into the tech lingo. How did you factor the infrastructure cost, capital, return on investment, maintenance into your analysis? And then a second question on the assumption is, what assumption did you make in terms of the market shares of the three powertrains that you looked into?
Sure. So for the first question, what were the costs assumed for the deployment of electric road systems? So I even have a graph for you for that. Is this graph on the left? This shows the range of infrastructure costs and also of utilization in gray. And this shows the costs that are assumed to pay back the infrastructure, and it's sourced from a range of literature estimates using both a conservative case and an optimistic case of what those costs might be. And as you can see, the cost to pay back infrastructure investment depends also on how much that infrastructure is utilized, aka how many trucks will use it per day, how many vehicles use it per day. The more trucks that use the infrastructure, the more those costs can be split and the lower the usage costs might be. And these black lines show, sorry, there's no legend in these figures, unfortunately. These black lines show typical flow rates in the United Kingdom. So typically, and these are also indicative of typical busy motorways in Europe. Typically, there are around 3,000 heavy-duty vehicles that would use motorways per day. So we aimed to really account for this uncertainty both in the construction costs, the investment costs, but also in their utilization costs, to really try and be as unbiased as possible in this. But here in particular, something important is what is the assumed payback also for the investment into it is they are likely to have to be government funded, and likely to have relatively long payback periods, which means that, again, it would have to be government funded rather than funded by the private sector.
Thank you. There are lots of questions about methodology and kind of what was factored into the assumptions, so on and so forth. I think that would be more interesting to have in a separate conversation. It gets quite detailed, and some of that I think is also in the report. So forgive me if I jump to some other questions. One I find interesting because I had the same kind of thought when I read the report. You say that the battery electric vehicles would face more operational constraints than the electric road systems. Intuitively, the opposite would be the case, that kind of the ERS can only be used on a fixed route, while the others are flexible. Where does that thought come from, that BEVs face more operational constraints?
They would face slightly more constraints in that there would be range limitations to battery electric vehicles. However, so with expected improvements in battery technologies, it would seem that these range requirements for battery electric trucks are likely to become less and less of an issue, but there would nonetheless still be place some kind of constraints on the use of trucks. Similarly, that would also mean that there would have to be specific slots that battery trucks would charge in for their applications, in a way that electric road systems, as long as they're on motorways, they could already start charging and would therefore have less constraints based on the range requirements and the time that it would take to also charge the battery.
We're nearing the end of the time that we have, and I know that Matteo has a meeting, unfortunately, after this, so we can't go very much beyond the allotted time. But let me throw out two questions in one that I see here, also regarding other technologies. Why did you not look at hydrogen combustion? And does the diesel internal combustion vehicle, that is sort of the benchmark, does that include the use of AdBlue, or kind of things that additives that make it less emitting and cleaner?
So on the final point, so AdBlue in particular is useful for reducing NOx emissions and air pollutant emissions, but less so for CO2 emissions. But in particular here, we focused in particular on the costs. We didn't then start looking at their CO2 effects. All of these options could help with decarbonization, provided they were used with low carbon energy. But yeah, at the moment in this scope of this analysis, we focus mostly on the costs. And sorry, remind me of the first part of the question.
That was hydrogen combustion.
Hydrogen combustion, exactly. That we didn't investigate, partly because we expect it to be less cost competitive anyway. So the internal combustion engine is less efficient than the fuel cell, and even less efficient than an electric vehicle, which means that hydrogen costs are likely to play an even greater part in the ownership costs of the vehicle. And we see that with hydrogen trucks, also fuel cell trucks, the hydrogen cost is the main determinant, is the main source of uncertainty. So the low energy efficiency of internal combustion engine hydrogen trucks mean that they're likely to be even less cost competitive than fuel cell trucks.
One question that Jean-Charles Crochet asks is whether you have a comparison of the total cost of ownership, whether you have a slide, maybe a chart somewhere that actually puts them one next to one another. That may be very useful.
I'm afraid I don't have that slide with me, but it's in the report.
Done relatively easily. Another question was whether you've also considered the total revenue of ownership, i.e. whether there are impacts on the revenue side that may be considerable.
No, we didn't account for it. There are a number of additional costs that not everything could be accounted for, but the vast majority of the main factors that influence the ownership costs are included. So it also included maintenance costs, financing costs, residual value of trucks. All of these things are all included within this analysis.
Great, thank you so much. I'm scrolling through the questions. This is more a comment, but I'll throw it out from an anonymous S&D. ERS likely to start operations sometime in early 2030, but at this time, the high-power charging infrastructure might be already deployed. Would you agree with that? That timing is also of the essence here and could actually, in fact, shape the decisions as much as the total cost of ownership considerations.
Agreed. So this is, I guess, one of the key takeaways that I think I would like to also leave listeners with, is that we need to develop a roadmap for what the decarbonization of the road freight sector might look like. And for this, we need to understand what can we do with existing technologies, or technologies that are likely to enter the market in the short term. So in particular, battery electric vehicles, starting with small vehicles and then moving up to the largest trucks. What can we achieve with that? And also, what are the limitations of battery electric vehicles in the real world as well? How long might it take to install depot charging facilities for all road freight operators? How long might it take to strengthen the electricity grid sufficiently? And also, realistically, what might the uptake of new trucks look like in the real world, accounting for behavioral constraints and things? And for this, once we understand that, then we can also understand what is necessary and whether electric road systems might be necessary. I think one of the worst case solutions would be if we started building technology or infrastructure for one technology, only to realize that it will only get us halfway. And then there would not be sufficient utilization of alternative infrastructure to fully decarbonize the sector. If we are confident that we're able to do everything with battery electric vehicles, and that may be the case, then we should definitely go for it. But I think there needs to just be a full assessment and roadmap of what that might look like, also in accounting for real world constraints.
Thank you very much, Matteo. We have to come to an end. I'm sorry. I apologize to those whose questions couldn't be answered here. I put Matteo's email in the chat. Forgive me, Matteo, you may be flooded, but I think that's the whole point of doing a report like that as an exchange on the findings and some questions and some diving deeper into the matter with people who work on this. You will see on your screen in a second a short survey with 2 questions. We use this just to find out whether what we do here is useful for you and to improve it. So maybe if you can find the time to just click twice on saying yes or no, that would be extremely useful. I invite you to download the report if you haven't done so already, to come and talk to us, to engage. As I said, these are collective works. Matteo is the author, he's put it all together, but behind that are 22 countries and 17 companies, international organizations. So there is some critical mass behind that. And if some of these recommendations become consensual and can be implemented, we will be in a better place a few years down the road. Thank you all for your time. Great to have you here. This video will be on our YouTube channel, I guess, on Monday. So we'll share the link with you so you can send it to colleagues or friends or other people who are interested. Thank you again for your time, for joining us, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.